Welcome to Dallas TRHT Social Community Events, where we are engaging with the Dallas community and our national community through social media. A few weeks ago, we had a Twitter chat about racial equity and COVID-19. 3 weeks ago, we had Instagram Live, where we talked about racial healing and COVID-19. Last week we were scheduled to do a Facebook Live, and we have rescheduled it for today. So thank you all for joining us. Today we will be discussing the history of race in Dallas, and we look forward to talking to you. We want to thank young professionals at the Dallas Regional Chamber for partnering with us and sharing the event. And we look forward to any questions that you have. So make sure that you put the questions in the comment section. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And welcome to the History of Race in Dallas Continued. We want you to follow us on Dallas TRHT, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. And during this season, we're using the hashtag COVID Equity DFW and a national Kellogg TRHT hashtag, How We Heal. And you can also find resources on Twitter or Instagram about history of Dallas or a history of race and racism by using the hashtag DTRHT syllabus. If you all have any resources that you want to share with the community, please use the hashtag. Now we want to just invite community agreements. These will be virtual. We're not together, but we are together in spirit. And so we invite you to listen with your eyes, ears, and heart. We invite you to notice moments of discomfort and stay curious. We want you to share your truth. This time, we're not going to speak our truth, but we're going to share our truth in the comment section or through email or through a message on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Be courageous and use I statements. Take care of yourself, especially during this time, and be open to the experience of the session and each other. Right now, I want to just really do a moment of reflection for the lives lost to COVID-19. More than 83,000 people have died in this country, and over 290,000 people have died. I'm talking about in the last 3 to 4 months. That is a tragedy. I really want us to just take a moment of reflection, share some energy to the families, think about people who have lost loved ones. I lost a loved one yesterday. So let's take a moment. As we're thinking about that, locally, what's been on my mind is the youngest person who died in Dallas County, Jamila Barber. She was a 17-year-old student in Lancaster, Texas. She was on the phone with her teacher and complained about feeling sick and apologized for not being able to turn in a homework assignment. The next day, she went to the hospital and said that she died in the ER. Her entire family is infected with COVID-19. And I really want us to think about the severity of this. I want us to stay safe. And I also want us to think about the racial implications of living in a society with structural racism and what it does for our communities and to our communities, and why Jamila, a 17-year-old who should be safe from this virus, is not protected. As of yesterday, Dallas County reported 236 new cases. This is actually the lowest number in 2 weeks. Every day in the last 2 weeks, we have had a record high number of cases. The total Dallas COVID-19 case count is 6,359. with over 140 deaths to this date. And that number could be rising if we don't take care of ourselves. Unfortunately, the state of Texas is back open, and I fear that we will see a record number of new cases. So everyone be safe out there. We also do a land and people acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that Dallas as a city is on stolen land. It is on the land of the Comanche, the land of the Caddo Nation, the land of the Wichita. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But we also want to acknowledge that Dallas is built by stolen people. After that land was stolen, white settlers brought their Black slaves from Tennessee, from Alabama, from Missouri, from Georgia, and those people built what we know now as Dallas. We want to acknowledge the land and people whenever we talk about Dallas, and acknowledge that this has a very important history and a legacy that we need to address and change. And we do that through our mission and framework. Dallas TRHT's mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. We do that by focusing on our framework. Our framework starts with narrative change, which includes two different ways. The first way is to create space for different narratives, different people, to tell the truth about what happened in this place, and to also address it. The second way is by what you see here, by addressing disparate narratives about people in the entertainment industry, journalism, news media, digital media, publishing, school curricula, cultural institutions, and monuments and park. A second part of this work is racial healing and relationship building. We live in a very segregated society, and our goal is to bring each other together by first dealing in truth, and also by healing ourselves, bringing ourselves to wholeness, addressing that race creates separation, and it also puts us in boxes, and that we want to start building relationships with each other that are long lasting and that are supportive, so we can do the work that is needed after that, which is the equitable policies and practices, or the transformation work. And that transformation work happens in three different buckets for us. The first is separation, which includes segregation, colonialization, and concentrated poverty. Things like arts and culture and housing and decolonization are in those. We include law as the second. It includes civil, criminal, and public policies. Things like juvenile justice and civil justice and mass incarceration are in there. And then the last but not least is economy, which includes structural inequality and barriers to opportunity. Things like the racial wealth gap, workforce and labor are in there. I want to note that we talk about the stories of immigration and migration together. Everyone has an immigration or a migration story. And so those things are really important to talk about together to build solidarity. We also talk about education and development together, and those things are in every one of our last framework. So we invite you to go to the WK Kellogg website to download our TRHT implementation guidebook. Has some really great information about this framework. When we started our work, we knew that there was a few guiding principles. Our first guiding principle was there must be an accurate recounting of history, both local and national. This is very important, particularly for Dallas, because Dallas is known as a very ahistorical city. In the guiding principle, it says that a common prerequisite for an effective and enduring effort to achieve racial equity and healing is a full and accurate knowledge of the role racism played in the evolution of communities. And it's very important for us to be aware of this in order to confront it and understand its relevance to contemporary community issues. It's very hard for folks to understand why there's a disparate effect of COVID-19 in Black and Indigenous communities right now, because they don't really understand the history. And so that's one of our goals for today, is to hope that you get some understanding of this local and national history. We compiled some of this local and national history in a Dallas TRHT report. You can download a PDF of that report if you go to our website, dallastrht.org/vision. That report compiles some of this community racial history and some other work that we'll talk about shortly. Our work is also covered in D Magazine. If you go to D Magazine's website, or if you Google the title of this article, it's called, "Is It Time to Change the Name of the Trinity River Back to the Arcocosa River?" The Arcocosa is the Caddo Nation name and original name of the river. It's not the Trinity River. And Peter Simic in D Magazine highlighted our work and what we hope to do. Just starting off, this is what Dallas looked like before there were white settlers. This is a Caddo Nation village. You can see that the architecture was very friendly to the earth, that folks lived off the land, that there was not much waste happening, that people really respected what nature provided. There's evidence that people indigenous to this land that became Dallas were here for at least 12,000 years. So we're talking about a long, long history of people living here, but not being acknowledged. This is another recreation of a Caddo village. You can see it's very sophisticated society. There are agriculture on the left side of the picture. Folks are communed in different style houses, but it's also very temporary and very earth-based. So if there was a flood, or if there was a reason to move, that folks can move very swiftly without doing a lot of damage to the earth. It's very important that we remember that Dallas is on stolen land. This is something that we'll continue to say. This is the first public policy of Dallas County. And if folks don't openly address this and talk about this, it'll be very hard for us to receive any type of healing and then receive any type of racial equity. This is a text from 1905. And the text, if we look at what has been left for us, it makes very clear and very plain language what happened in Texas and in North Texas specifically. I'll just read this last paragraph. It says, "The main object of this book will be to place on record a correct history of the facts connected with and the sacrifices made by early settlers in order to redeem this great land from the hands of the roving bands of Indians that had always occupied it and had done nothing to develop it." This makes really clear the objectives of settlers, really just to steal the land. Gail Thomas, a local Dallas scholar, in her 1980s book, The Stirrings of Culture, asks a question. She says, "Why is it that the Caddo Indian massacre led by General Tarrant on the banks of the Trinity in 1841 is not remembered in the founding of Dallas? The Caddo village massacre freed up the land to be bought and sold. Its inhabitants gone, Bryan was free to stake his claim on the land. And John Neely Bryan is known as the so-called founder of Dallas. But we see that is not the case. Further evidence is given by A.C. Green in an older text called A Town Called Cedar Springs. And it says the Keechee village, which had been located at the spring, and the spring is where modern day Cedar Springs Road is, or what the neighborhood they call Harwood. By 1984, moved to Village Creek in the western part of Arlington. And Arlington is where the Cowboy Stadium is and the Texas Ranger Stadium is currently. That Indian village would be the site of a destructive battle later in May 1841. And 1841 is when it all changed. a battle in which John Neely Bryant, the founder of Dallas, John B. Denton, whom Denton County is named, General Edward Tarrant, from whom Tarrant County is named, John Reagan, for whom Reagan County is named, and Surveyor Warren Ferris all participated in this massacre. Um, this is definitely not taught in our local school districts. It's not even taught in higher ed here locally. So it's very important that we start to address these first public policies of Dallas. And one of the arguments too of talking about this is that race is always talked in a binary here, but there's a reason. So right after 1841, after this Caddo Indian massacre, the only people that lived in what became Dallas County were white settlers and their enslaved black folks that they owned and subjugated to work. So it literally became a binary society. And that leads us to the second public policy of Dallas, is that Dallas was built with stolen labor. I always lift up the name of Jane Elkins. She is somebody that we should all know if you live in this city or even in North Texas. Even in Texas, Jane Elkins is the first bill of sale in Dallas County. And here from the history of Dallas County is that bill of sale. It says the first bill of sale recorded in Dallas County, August 9th, 1846, was from Edward Wellborn to Young, and it follows: I have this day sold to John Young, a Negro woman named Jane, and child, aged about 20 years, with said Negro I warrant to be both sound, both in body and mind. And this is what's different about American chattel slavery. It says a slave for life. In other slave societies, such as Brazil and other ones, slavery was not for life. It also continues and says, this said Young, in consideration of said property, has this day paid to me the sum $400. I bind myself to warrant and defend the title of said Negro unto said Young, his heirs, and his assigns forever. Given under my hand this the 17th of March, 1844. My first question when I read this was, why did Dallas County choose to record the sale of Jane as their first bill of sale? If you know anything about this time, there were goods being sold like lumber. There was, animal skins being traded. It is really important to really interrogate why this is the first bill of sale. And it's a question that we need to contend with. I think the first comment that we have from this, from the viewers is, can we get a list of citations? We definitely can get a list. If you go to the report and you download it, the report is on our website. We have a opening list of recommendations of readings. It's on the back page. And I guarantee you that once you read those, you'll see the rest of the citations. So I look forward to hearing what folks are reading. To put this in modern day kind of context, this is where I live right now. This is where I'm standing. You can see I live on the corner of Northwest Highway and Lemon or Marsh in Northwest Dallas. Jane Elkins is reported to live right next to where I live. The preacher at the Cochran Chapel UMC, if you look on the right, on the corner of Northwest Highway and Midway, the text said that Cochran Cemetery has some of the founders of Dallas buried there. So the Marshes, the Bachmans, the Knights, who are all slave owners also, are buried there. If you look in the middle, going west on Northwest Highway, you'll see Garvin Memorial Cemetery. That is a Confederate Memorial Cemetery. South of that cemetery, once those Confederate soldiers got back to Dallas, they provided some land for their former slaves who formed an enclave called Elm Thicket North Park, which is still here. It's a freedmen's town. They gave them some land right on Bachman Creek, and Bachman Creek is the water source that trickles into a creek east of Bachman Lake. There's a cemetery where over 100 folks are buried with unmarked graves. And I always lift up the name of Linda Rogers, a Latina girl who was killed in an explosion when Atmos gas did not change the infrastructure underneath our feet. And this community that is mostly Latinx has suffered in that environmental disaster. So I always lift up her name, rest in peace, Linda Rogers. I want to continue by talking about 1860. So in 1860, there was a fire attributed to abolitionists. But it really was a year of upheaval all over the country. In 1860, there were slave uprisings all over. Folks were just tired of being enslaved, wanted some freedom, and folks were revolting against their captors. And there was some talk about that happening here. There were abolitionists coming from northern states, railing against Dallas leadership because they were slave owners. And what happened was there was a fire in downtown Dallas that burned everything to the ground. What's widely known as a story of a man burning a cigar and instead of extinguishing it, let it burn and actually burned it to the ground. That crime was attributed to 3 Black men who were hung on the banks of the Trinity River. There was a vigilante, they called a group called the Committee of 52 that decided to hang Uncle Cato, Pat Jennings, and Sam Smith after discussing what to do with the remaining slaves in the county. What they decided to do, because they wanted to kill every slave in Dallas County, but they knew that that would obviously affect their bottom line, they decided to whip every enslaved person in Dallas County. We're talking about over 1,000 people who were whipped in 1860. And whether they were guilty or not, they were taken to the banks of the Trinity River near the Triple Underpass. And so currently, that space where the river used to be is called Martyrs Park. This is a screenshot of the Dallas Park and Recreation website. As you can see, there's no description on what happened here. There's no sharing of that history, and that's something that we need to talk about for sure. Reconstruction started to happen, and something amazing happened in Dallas County. Former enslaved folks started to buy up land from their former enslavers. And we see freedmen's towns in Dallas County start to emerge and pop up. The largest of which in the center is Freedmen's Town, short North Dallas. That included a large space of what is now Uptown. There was another string town that connected Freedmen's Town to Deep Ellum, which is also still here. Deep Ellum used to be the entertainment district where blues and jazz players came and played, but now it is a entertainment district. 10th Street, which is also here. Elm Thicket, North Park, which I talked about earlier. Alpha, where the Galleria Mall is, was a Freedmen's Town. Bonner Farm, Anderson Bonner was one of the largest landowners in Dallas at this time, which is an amazing feat for a formerly enslaved person. White Rock was also a freedmen's town, and there's another smaller freedmen's town called Little Egypt. Also want to talk about Joppy, which is also still here, which is a freedmen's town, and there's several others. To the left of the screen is Bear Creek, which is in Irving, which has preserved some of their freedmen's town and turned it into a museum. There's also Mosier Valley and the Garden of Eden, which is actually has a book written about it, Garden of Eden. I want to fast forward to 1910 and the lynching of Allen Brooks. The first thing that struck me when I saw this picture were the two kids in the foreground. That this public lynching, which happened in downtown Dallas on the corner of Main and Acker, was a very public and regular thing. Folks gathered from all over the city and county to come see this lynching. There was a story that says that Allen Brooks was working for a family, and that the young girl that he was working with, the young girl of a family he was working with, came out of bush with him, and that she had scratches on her leg. There was a story that a doctor examined her and said that Allen Brooks raped her. He was immediately arrested and taken to Dallas County Courthouse, which is still standing. It's called the Old Red Museum on Main. During the arraignment, instead of going to jail, he was forced to put a noose over his neck. There was a mob that broke into the courthouse, put a noose around his neck, and pulled him out of the second floor window of Main, on the Main Street side, and dragged him up this street right here that you see. This is called the Elks Arc. It is no longer there, but this is what was what Main Street looked like at the time. And you can see that this portrait shows the art right here at the top, but it also shows Allen Brooks, who was hung on a light pole near the arch. This was made famous because it became a postcard, and with a lot of spectacle at the time, particularly around the hangings of Black people. They were made into postcards, which talks about the depravity of the society during that time. I mean, how crazy it is to create postcards. This is a very gruesome event. Folks would take souvenirs from Allen Brooks, including body parts, including clothing. Kids wanted pieces of his clothing. It was a very gruesome event. But this was made really famous. It is talked about in a lot of documentaries. This postcard is featured in the 1619 Project for the New York Times. Brian Stevenson features it in his museum in Alabama. So it's a very popular hanging. Dallas has not talked about it at all until recently. There's no remembrance of Allen Brooks anywhere in Dallas, but hopefully that will change soon as folks have fought for remembrance. You can see the postcard here from a Dr. Jay Williams, who talked about being deeply in the crowd, and that was a great day in Dallas. And here's another postcard. This picture was taken hours after the hanging, but you can see there were still thousands of people on the street. And 2 hours, I'll read it right here, it says 2 hours after the lynching of the Negro rapist Brown, he was drugged through the street from the courthouse and hanged to the southwest corner of the arch. The crowd seen in the picture is nothing to be compared to the mob at the time of the picture was taken. The mob had already left the scene and was on the way to the courthouse looking for other Black people. So it was a very perilous time, 1910. And this is a picture of the corner now. You can see how kind of eerie it is to look at this corner and know that it's a gruesome sight of a hanging, a lynching, a murder. I also want to say that Congress in 2020 just passed an anti-lynching bill for the first time in history. It's called an Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. And I think it is amazing in 2020 to pass a bill about lynching, something that could have obviously saved thousands of people's lives, particularly Black people and Latinx people in Texas. This is, one of the most stark headlines I've seen in the city. It says, when Dallas was the most racist city in America. And it really talks about how in the early 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan basically ruled Dallas. 1 out of every 3 eligible men were part of the Ku Klux Klan. This is an advertisement from the State Fair of Texas. And it says, meet your friends. Ku Klux Klan Day is one of the days at the State Fair of Texas. And the public was invited to witness the largest initiation of the largest class in Klandom. There were over 7,000 people initiated into the Ku Klux Klan on this day, and over 50,000 people went to see this induction into the Ku Klux Klan. There was a comment right here before we move on. Someone said, I thought that the city council cited to install a memorial at Martyrs Park for the lives lost due to lynching, or was that only for Allen Brooks, or will there be 2 memorials? That's a great question. What happened was when the Confederate monuments were discussed at City Hall, Councilman Felder at the time brought up Allen Brooks and that there should be a memorial for Allen Brooks. At that time, the city council earmarked some funding for a memorial of Allen Brooks to happen on the corner of Main and Ackert. Unfortunately, DART is putting a station on Main and Ackert. And so Main and Ackert became a place where it would be just not a great place to have a memorial for lynching. There had also been folks fighting for Martyrs Park to become a memorial for victims of racial violence. And that process is still happening. And so hopefully the funding for the memorial for victims of racial violence will be at Martyrs Park, and Allen Brooks will be remembered there, but that's still happening. There will not be 2 memorials. I think that the Martyrs Park will be the memorial, but it's still work being done. So that's a great question. This is also really stark to see that despite the Confederate monument that was removed, which was the Robert E. Lee Memorial, there's still a Confederate War Memorial next to our City Hall, but there's also streets named after Confederate or Klan members that still exist. These are streets that I drive on every day when I left the house. You're talking about, we'll start to our right with the R.L. Thornton Freeway, who was a member of the Klan and also a city leader. Gaston Avenue, Junior Street. I used to work over there at a school called Lipscomb. Peak Street, Cabell Drive, Reagan Street, Lee Parkway, Lemon Avenue, which I live next to. I can see it outside my window. Throckmorton Street, Young Street, Gano Street, Irvay Street, Good Latimer Expressway, which I also work on. So there's abundance of streets named after Confederate or Ku Klux Klan members still here in Dallas in 2020. This is a sign too that after the Confederate era and after the Ku Klux Klan era came Jim Crow era in Dallas. And Jim Crow era was a also a very brutal era for Black people, for Latino people, and other people of color here in Dallas and North Texas. This is a sign from the Lone Star Restaurant Association. This association sold and gave these signs out to establishments. And the first thing I noticed, and I'm sure that some of you all notice, is that the order of which these words are placed on this placard starts off with no dogs first, and then Negroes, and then Mexicans. We know at the time, after 1910, after the Mexican Revolution, we started to see more and more Mexican immigrants coming to Texas, particularly North Texas, looking for work after the reformation of the Mexican government. And you see them being included in racist Jim Crow laws that also affected Black folks and basically every person of color here in Dallas and North Texas. So this influx of people and these Jim Crow laws led to segregated public spaces, particularly public housing in West Dallas. But this is a story. It starts in 1937, and it starts with the federal government. The story of redlining. This is a map of Dallas. This is a homeowners loan corporation map in 37. On the right is the red line map. And I'll talk about that in a minute. On the left is a description or a security map. And this is kind of the first indicator of what will happen to a city in a pandemic, because the language that used in these descriptors to talk about housing also are the language that are used in pandemics. Things like scourge, things like filthy, things like lower grade are also words that are used in CDC documents. But we'll get to that in a minute. How did this policy work? So basically, to ensure mortgage values, particularly to ensure folks who were looking for a mortgage and to be guaranteed by the federal government, folks would go to a bank and it would be insured by what is now called the FHA. But like everything in this country, it was based on race. Folks who were given a first grade or eligible for 80% of their mortgage value to be insured were classified as exclusively white and green lined in areas that were green on this map. And so you can see all of the green areas that still exist, like Kessler Park and Lake Highlands. The mostly white areas were viewed as second grade, or the blue areas. They were eligible for 60 to 80% of their mortgage value. And you can see the blue areas here. Some of those areas still exist as well. The most third grade areas who were eligible for 15% of their mortgage values, if that, were mixed areas or poor areas, areas in which some poor immigrants live, like some Mexican immigrants or even some poor Jewish immigrants. If they were eligible for mortgages, they were given, very hard places to live. And so you can see the yellow areas there. And then there was the red line areas. There were deemed mostly Black areas. They were redlined by the federal government and deemed ineligible for mortgage insurance, which means that they could not get a mortgage. At this time, a mortgage, owning a house was the only way you can move up in society. It was the only way you can build wealth in this society, particularly if you were formerly enslaved, you're one generation out of slavery, and folks were excluded from that. practice. And so this impact of redlining started this bias, right? And this is really very important to talk about with history, because it's not just folks who have poor health, folks who had existing preconditions. The Negro population was viewed as detrimental influence that posed a risk to public health and property value, right? So you had your own body, your own existence was viewed as a detrimental influence, right? And so it led to this structural disinvestment of the people in place. Folks were denied access to capital. Folks were denied access to business loans, and it was very hard for folks to have and maintain very healthy and very vibrant communities. And then a decline started to happen. Over time, this inability to maintain your property because you don't have a mortgage loan, you don't have ways to build equity, abandonment and blight, and then future investment was even more discouraged. So folks would say, don't live there. Folks would say, you don't want to go to school there. And then we see this hyper segregation of communities. And that's the impact of redlining. And that's actually kind of how it also affected public health. And you see these huge disparities right now. And you can see some of the headlines that emerged from there. This says public housing was demanded by Dallas Negroes. Obviously, public housing is demanded because folks are not given access to mortgage loans, even if they can afford it. But there's also bombing happening, and we'll talk about that shortly. Here in this Dallas report on the Committee of Negro Housing in 1950, it says, we remind the people of Dallas that if we do not provide home sites for Negroes who want and can't afford to buy or rent suitable and decent homes, the alternative is terrible tension resulting from Negroes buying into white neighborhoods. The committee feels that the only satisfactory and permanent solution to this problem can be realized where there's racial segregation, right? And so you see this committee on Negro housing saying that segregation should be part of the story, it should be permanent in the city of Dallas. There was a comment that says, is anyone working to rename those streets? I would say yes, there's always been people working to rename the streets that are named after Confederate and Ku Klux Klan members. But the argument from city council has always been that it'll be expensive for business owners to change the name of those streets. And so they, for the most part, have left the streets unchanged, the street names unchanged. There should be more folks working on those street names, but that is definitely something that folks have been working on for a long time. And so this quote in D magazine that anti-Black racism gave birth in West Dallas to the greatest concentration of low-rise family public housing in the United States. I mean, how do you get the greatest concentration of low-rise family public housing in the United States? Because of a federal policy that became a state policy that became a city policy that says that we're not going to help the Black community and the Latino community build wealth through owning homes. We're going to relegate them to public housing and to segregated communities. An example of that is this book, Goals for Dallas. Goals for Dallas was a document created after JFK's assassination. And it talks about the prevailing myths and dominant narratives that happened. And I want to talk about this one passage in there because it is encompassing of how myths are created and how dominant narratives are established. This is about folks in West Dallas. And so it says 30,000 Negroes live in one federal public housing development in West Dallas. And we already just talked about the history of how that public housing was even created. Folks weren't allowed to even buy homes, right? So they have to find homes where they can get them. It says many have incomes ranging from $2,000 down. Conversely, there are some who are homeowners, have steady jobs, own their cars, send their children to college, but these latter are the minority. The others are people who often need to be taught where recreation is. So that's the first kind of crazy thing in this passage, because if you know any Black people, they'll need to be taught where recreation is. Says still sometimes the only way to reach them is in the area of recreation, right? So there's a contradictory statement. It says the school, lots of them leave it. And that's another false prevailing myth. During this time, there were beautiful schools being built. There's tons of anecdotal evidence and data that says that Black people never miss school. There's people who like said they love school. They would, if they were sick, they would still go to school, which I don't recommend, obviously, but they loved school. It says the church, many of them do not go to church. It was obviously one of the craziest statements I've read. If you've been to Dallas, Dallas has some of the highest numbers of churches per capita of any city in the country. Says the job, lots of them don't have it. That was also false. Folks worked in the service industry, worked in the hospitality industry, retail industry. The family, lots of them don't have it either, which is also false. So there's this establishment of prevailing myths and dominant narratives that were false and not really based on very racist beliefs. Another settlement that popped up is also Little Mexico. El Barrio, which popped up in what is now known as Victory Park or Harwood. This area was once a Jewish settlement called Frogtown. And once those Jewish settlers found other space to live in South Dallas and in North Dallas, after the Mexican Revolution, Mexican immigrants started to move into this neighborhood, and it became a bustling barrio. I want to highlight the story of Santos Rodriguez, who was a DISD student and was accused of stealing out of a corner store. A police officer, Daryl Kane, came to his grandmother's house in the middle of the night and took him and his little brother out and put him in the back of a car and played Russian roulette with them and killed Santos Rodriguez in the back of a car, a police car, in front of his brother. The officer was arrested and convicted. He was the first in the 1970s, first officer in Dallas County convicted of murder, which was wild because the Dallas Police Department was involved in a lot of murders of people of color during that time. But this case was something that happened that united the Black and brown community in downtown Dallas, which this picture is shown. They had an uprising, probably the only so-called riot that Dallas ever had. For 2 days, folks marched in the street asking for justice for Santos. They even, disturbed some property. They broke windows. Here's a scene, they're burning a police vehicle. You can see the solidarity here. There's just a lot of Black and brown people in Dallas being tired of police violence. And this is one of those times in which the communities had solidarity with each other. It was really interesting too, because this is also something that the city of Dallas did not acknowledge. A really interesting story is that a few years ago, the city of Seattle created the Santos Rodriguez Park, because remember, a lot of these stories that happen in communities, particularly in Dallas, we don't hear about them at all, but the nation highlights them and talks about them all the time. To the bottom right corner is the park district in which Santos Rodriguez had a park named after him in Seattle, Washington. They flew Santos's mom, who had not at the time received an apology from the city of Dallas. Mayor Rawlings finally apologized to Santos's mom doing a city event. But you can see in the top right-hand corner, activists really fighting for a park, which is called Pike Park, to be named after Santos Rodriguez. The park has not been renamed, but the park recreational center has been named after Santos Rodriguez at this point. I also want to highlight the Deepwood dump, which was the largest illegal dump in Texas history in South Dallas. What we know as Pleasant Grove, for 20 years, from 1982 to 2000, in a community that has suffered from white flight in Pleasant Grove. From 1970 to 1980, white residents moved out of Pleasant Grove as Black residents started to move in looking for housing. Once that community became majority Black, the city allowed illegal dumping to happen. And right when that illegal dumping started, the community resisted. They went to city council, they filed grievances with the council people there. And they said that this illegal dumping is happening, is causing toxic fumes, is causing pollution, it is causing illnesses to happen. And the city didn't do anything about it. The residents had to sue the city of Dallas. And the result was really a reparations ordinance. The city was forced to turn that land into a landfill. And Trinity River Audubon Center was created from the activism of those Black residents in 75217. And so every resident of 75217 can attend this Trinity River Audubon Center for free. It's a beautiful place. I've been there several times. I've taken one of the first student groups to canoe from here because it's right on the Trinity River. But the question is, does the community of 75217 know that this is for them because of the hard work of residents who had to hold the city accountable? It's really important. And it's still happening to this day, where pollution and dumping, particularly illegal dumping, is still occurring in that community on the Trinity River Basin. I want to highlight the story of Marsha Jackson, who is a retired woman who is now back working because of health concerns, who is fighting the city of Dallas again because of this mountain of shingles behind her. It's called Shingle Mountain. And here's another picture just to see how massive this mountain is right behind our house that has been allowed to happen because the city has poor regulations on folks who work in industries. The southern sector, which is majority Black and is the largest sector in the city, has suffered from environmental and ecological waste dumps like this for a long time. And this is happening right now. Shingle Mountain still exists. On Earth Day this year, Marsha, Downwinders at Risk, and other folks had a campaign to get the mayor of Dallas to come down and see what had transpired in the community. The city has already been held accountable, and they have refused to remove it. So we're still, hoping that something happens and, this mountain is removed from Miss Marsha's backyard. I also want to highlight the work of Juanita Craft. Juanita Craft is a legendary figure in Dallas. In any other city, she would be a legend, and we barely know her name. She and her estate granted the home in which she lived to the city of Dallas. Is now one of the sites managed by the city of Dallas. It's a museum. But Juanita Craft was a civil rights activist. She was a voters' rights activist. She and her Craft kids were the young folks who fought the segregation of the State Fair of Texas. The State Fair of Texas is the largest state fair in the country. And during this time, there was only one day in which Black people could go to the state fair. It was called the Negro Day. And one day out of the year when the state fair was running, state fair ran at least a month, Black people were allowed to go one day. And Ms. Craft organized these kids and changed that. She also worked with gay rights activists in the city. She also worked with voters' rights activists. She sold poll tax. And we all know poll tax was a way of creating voter suppression. So there's a lot of things that she did that we don't understand. Out of her tree became Al Lipscomb, who was an activist who became a city council person. Miss Craft was also a city council person at the time. Diane Ragsdale, who is still an activist in the community. I also want to talk about the Dirty Dozen, this group of Hispanic and Latino and Latina activists who fought and got politically activated in the city, particularly Adolfo Caello, who is a legend across this country, who was a lawyer who fought for civil rights for Latino people here in Dallas. We should all know her name. A school is named after her, but most of us don't even know who she is. Elsie Faye Hagens. Here's showing the Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard sign, which she fought for. She was a councilwoman and also someone who fought for rights of South Dallas residents. And Dr. Mamie McKnight, who was a historian, who really was a scientist, who started off as a really brilliant scientific mind. And because she was a Black woman, she was denied the right to practice science and became an educator and historian, and led to the establishment of the Freemanstown Memorial, which she really worked on. We need to remember the name of Dr. Mamie McKnight. Part of our work is also a compelling vision, accompanied by a set of ambitious and achievable goals, both long-term and short-term, that must be developed, and progress must be regularly assessed. And so the second guiding principle that we use to develop our work is racial healing to occur. We need a compelling vision to talk about our journey and to talk about what success would look like. And so we started a community visioning process in which we brought together residents to ask them questions about their history in the community, but also what are our shared vision and goals as Dallas people and people live in Texas and people live in this country. We also talked about a vision. What would Dallas look like and feel like without racism, and what it'll take to get there? And we worked on that, and some of the themes that emerged were a focus on education and a focus on economy. And so while we did that focus on education and economy, we started to drill down and actually do some reports. And so also on our website, you can download it, is an economic supplement report. We're still working on the education report, and we'll be reposting it in the near future. But we also talked about some really specific things under that. That education in Dallas has always been segregated by race. Public education in Dallas was segregated from race from the beginning and remains segregated today. The official date for public schools in Dallas is considered to be June 16, 1884, in which 4 white schools and 2 colored schools constitutes the city's new public school system. And of course, this segregated way of living in schools was very racist. This is a picture from North Dallas High School. This is the blackface rendition of folks. There was so many groups that like practice Jim Crow practices of blackface in schools. This is also another group that practiced Jim Crow songs and dressed in blackface. This is also from North Dallas High School. There are several other schools around this area, including Ursuline, including other schools that use the practice of blackface regularly. There was also violence that was happening because of segregation. The South Dallas School, and this is from the Dallas Morning News in 1941. Um, South Dallas, which at the time mostly white, threatened violence if this Negro high school reopened. And this is Lincoln High School. And so the first high school that was for black students was Booker T. Washington. That school was so overcrowded that kids only went half a day. Juniors and seniors went the first half of the day, and freshmen and sophomore went the second half of the day. They were so overcrowded that they needed to build a new school, which became Lincoln. Lincoln High School was the second high school for black people in Dallas, and it was a beautiful school. And white residents in South Dallas says that they formed a guard around Lincoln High School to prevent its opening as a black school. And those residents said that, this is not okay, and we'll fight if we're not protected. And so you can see the Dallas Express from 1941 says, it says, "Not through with the Lincoln High School yet," says South Dallas whites. It says, "Threats hurled at school children at board in meetings." And it says, "Negro will protect children if police fail to do their duty." And so you can see even just going to school is a very difficult process for black residents in Dallas during Jim Crow. There's also a very important educational thing that we have to talk about is Mansfield High School. This is a national story that folks talk about all the time. Brian Stevenson and EJI have it as part of their calendar, but we don't talk about it at all. It actually set the precedent for the South. After Brown versus Board in 1954, 2 years after Brown versus Board, black communities tried to enroll in Mansfield High School. Mansfield is a southern suburb of Dallas. They were met with a mob, and those mobs formed. Over 300 folks showed up. And what was said was that if those black families come into school and try to enroll, that they will be hung and castrated. And so you can see in this picture is actually the first day of school in which students went to school with this effigy, which is basically a representation of a black person being hung on top of their school. There's also an effigy hung right outside the school on a tree and one on a light pole. This was so tense as a situation that the Texas Rangers were called, the governor of Texas was called, even the president of the United States was briefed on what happened at Mansfield. Those black families were forced to go to Fort Worth ISD, and this set a precedent for Southern schools not to integrate until later in the 1960s and some in the 1970s. Some schools didn't even integrate until recently. So, and there's still massive school segregation happening. This event at Mansfield High School is very important in the history of education. Also important in Dallas was that Dallas also set precedent for equal wages for teachers. And so black teachers were looking for equal wages because they were getting lower wages than white teachers. The story was that because black teachers were educated at black schools, that their education was inferior, particularly because black teachers at the time went to HBCUs. And so Thurgood Marshall, in his brilliance and his team, found Thelma Page Richardson, a black teacher in Dallas who was educated in Denver, who at the time went to schools that were mostly white. And she was also educated at a white higher ed university. She was the perfect case, and Thurgood Marshall and his group of lawyers won that case. And Dallas ISD had to equalize pay for teachers by race and also had to pay back pay. And so this case of equalizing pay for teachers in the country started in Dallas and started with Thelma Page Richardson, which is a school is also named after her in Dallas. I want to highlight Annie Heads Rainwater, who was a Black woman who fought for Carrollton ISD schools to be integrated. Carrollton is a northwestern suburb of Dallas. Students had to come all the way to Booker T to Dallas to go to high school because that was the only school in the county that they can go to. And their bus would break down in 100-degree weather. It was just terrible. And so she fought for kids to enroll in Carrollton ISD. Wanted to highlight Annie Rainwater. Also Sam Tasby, who in 1970 was tired of his kids being segregated and forced to go to another school. And so he sued the district, Dallas ISD, to integrate. And for 40 years, Dallas ISD had to go through court cases in which found them to be negligible in their integration. And Dallas ISD finally was let off the court case in 2003. So Sam Tasby, who also has a school named after him now, was vital in integrating schools in Dallas. Catherine Gilliam, who also has a house museum named after her in Dallas. She was the first Black person and first woman to be president of the school board. She fought for educational rights for kids of color and particularly Black communities in South Dallas. And we should remember her name. She's done a lot of work. We should also visit her house museum in South Dallas as well. Trini Garza, who was the first Latino elected to the school board. Trini still living, still kicking. He's still a great activist, and he is really a great guy. Talked to him several times, and he's done a lot of work for education here in Dallas for Latino kids and kids of color. There's also a school named after him. And Carla Garcia, in the last couple of years, the first Latina elected to the school board, which is amazing to me. That in 2019, finally, was a Latina woman was elected to the school board. Carla's doing great work, and we look forward to more of her work. I also wanted to bring up this article from 2014. Eric Nicholson was a really good writer. Highlighted that Dallas ISD was one of the most segregated school districts in the country. And this passage from that article that says that one important measure that the researchers use to gauge integration is minority exposure to white students, calculated based on the racial composition of individual campuses. It says Dallas ISD ranked dead last, at least among the 50 largest urban school districts that have been on federal desegregation plans. So it's really highlighting the deep segregation of Dallas ISD. Dallas ISD is 95% kids of color. It is definitely a segregated school district. And then we also talked about economy. On the National Day of Racial Healing, we invited folks to come. Economy in Dallas also began with the death of land and slavery to exploit labor. Of course, the policy again starts with land. There's no economy without land. And this land is stolen land, which means it belongs to someone else, and we removed them and killed them off their land. It is very important that we understand that. Economy starts with land, and that land belongs to someone else. I also want to highlight cotton as an industry, because we also don't talk about this in Dallas, even though it is literally, the history is littered in our city with cotton. This is a picture of the Cotton Bowl, which is a very important sports site in our city. It's in the State Fair, Texas, in Fair Park. I was always, as a kid, wondering why this was here. But I started to do some inquiry and some work, and realized that Dallas was also called King Cotton. It was called King Cotton because this was the place for cotton in the South, and it still is. And we'll talk about that. This is a postcard from the Library of Congress. It says a lot of gay cotton pickers, Dallas, Texas. And so you can see even the folks, and this is not during slavery, this is after slavery. This is folks who are sharecropping, which was called by scholars slavery by another name. I won't read all this, but it really talks about, this is an article called The White Stuff. I implore you all to just Google this article. It is an amazing article that talks about how cotton was integral to everything that happened here, particularly the economy. I'll continue by showing some more examples of how famous Dallas was for cotton, that folks would continue to take pictures of sharecroppers, particularly the Black sharecroppers who picked the cotton. And also, you know, as an educator, the first thing that I see here and I was struck by was that there were young kids, younger than 10 years old, picking cotton, part of the economy, you know, and Dallas cotton was so big, this is a world economy. And I'll talk about that shortly. This is the back of that. This really talks about Dallas. I'll read part of it. It says, the sharecrop South produced cotton as never before, with Texas now leading the way. The federal government swept Native Americans from Texas commodity frontier, and that's the land part, right? And so now the labor. And so by the 1880s, inland Dallas had become an important cotton trading hub, staffed by representatives of the world's largest agribusinesses. Now that is an important story. The world's largest agribusinesses. By 1920, the raw cotton produced had spread all the way to the plains of far west Texas and was 10 times it had been in 1960, right? So cotton had grew 10 times it was after slavery by sharecropping and by Black folks picking this cotton. It says, but the technology of cotton farming required the same unchanged work from the antebellum era, requiring hoeing, weeding, and hand picking. And so you can see how massive it was in Dallas. These are also postcards. On the left is the postcard from the new Cotton Exchange building. You see how massive it was, but this building wasn't even big enough to handle the cotton that was being processed here in Dallas. And so a larger kind of skyscraper looking building was built called the Dallas Cotton Exchange building. And you see how massive that building is. By 1900, Dallas emerged as the largest inland cotton market in the world. And that is amazing to even think about, how this city was the largest inland cotton port in the world. And you can see this is Forney's cotton production. Forney is a small suburb out of Dallas, but you can see how much cotton was being produced. Texas is also still #1 in cotton production, even though it's not a cash crop anymore. The federal government is subsidizing the crops, but cotton is still the one of the #1 things that Texas produce. Also, I want to say that this is part of mass incarceration too, because prisoners still pick cotton for the state of Texas. It becomes a very interesting story too, because after the Japanese government bombed Pearl Harbor, these were the first 5 people who were picked up by the Dallas police who have been federalized to pick up people and intern them. 3 of these people pictured worked for the Japanese Cotton Company. They were here because Dallas world market for cotton was so large that it required Japanese nationals. Folks from all over the world were here for the cotton in Dallas. But unfortunately, because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, folks who were here for the business got caught up in the geopolitics and were interned. This is a Japanese internment camp in Seagoville Prison. Seagoville is a south suburb of Dallas. This was a women's prison that became an internment camp. for years. Those Japanese folks, Italian folks, German folks, and also folks who were being held in Panama and other places were interned here for years. They were here so long that there was currency created, including the currency you see right here that says Seagoville Internment Camp. And this U.S. treatment of Japanese folks also was talked about in Japan. And I love this quote from a Japanese national who was interned in Dallas, but also deported to Japan. He said, despite their talk of liberty and equality, Americans behave as if they and only they are entitled to the benefits. And when he's talking about Americans, he's talking about white Americans. Pictured here is a Dallas police officer who was going through items he had picked up on an internment raid. I also wanted to highlight the city charter. This is the 1931 to 1968 City of Dallas Charter. And this charter was a segregation of races charter. And so the City of Dallas on the books authorized the segregation of races. And it says the City of Dallas shall have the power by ordinance duly passed to provide the use of separate blocks for residences, places of abode, places of public amusement, churches, schools, and places of assembly by members of the white and colored race. And in the city charter, it says this: the term colored race, as used herein, shall include all persons of African descent, and the term white race, as used here, shall include all persons not of the colored race, as colored race as defined herein. And so you can see this city charter lasted for over 35 years and was so important to understanding how the city was set up. You can see, though, when it started to come down, you can see signs that were in public places. This is a sign that says white and Negro passengers must occupy the respective spaces or seats indicated by the signs. He was taking it down, and you can see that Black folks who were also using public transportation were pointing to the sign because they knew it was time for it to be taken down, but they were still sitting at the back of the bus. I also want to highlight this for economy. This was a passage from Jim Schutt's The Accommodation. And it says that after desegregation, it says the authority finally ruled today the desegregation of Dallas was ordered. It was to be instant, total. Of course, it would not entail real desegregation of the schools, the actual mixing of large numbers of children. That was never to occur. That still has not occurred, nor would the neighborhoods integrate. The white neighborhoods, the better off ones anyway, can take care of themselves. As long as Black people in Dallas stay poor enough, there would be no great danger there. And so you can see kind of the impetus for folks who were in power in Dallas to economically keep folks in a similar or same place. The redlining map again. Here's racial restriction. This is a D restriction that actually was in Preston Hollow, a neighborhood that George Bush moved into. So when he moved into his Preston Hollow house, when he moved into Dallas, they still had a deed restriction. And this deed restriction said, no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. And this is also an ad for segregated community in Dallas. This is the ideal edition. This says the latest, best, and desirable resident edition in Dallas, exclusively for colored people. And so you can see neighborhoods like Ideal, which is right next to Bonton in South Dallas, was created exclusively for Black people. I also wanted to highlight the South Dallas bombing campaigns that happened when Black people tried to move into what was known as white South Dallas at the time. From 1929 to 1951, there was a series of terrorist bombings happened where Black residents who can afford to move into this white neighborhood had their houses bombed, literally bombed. You can see here Dallas Express bombing attacks renewed on Negro homes in Dallas. The calm of Sabbath night broke by bombing number 12. You can see here a bomb rocks South Dallas home. A dynamite bomb blast Wednesday night damaged a South Dallas house in which a Negro family had been living in for a month. And you can see the actual picture here. It's not really a good quality, but it shows that literal dynamite was being thrown on people's porches or bombs were being planted because Black people moved into white South Dallas. And some of the reasons why we talked about economy was some of the headlines that you see here. Dallas-Fort Worth has some of the worst income equality by neighborhood in Dallas, in the US. Dallas ranked dead last in a study of economic inclusivity. This was a study by the Urban Institute. And then leads to some conversations around, some pandemics and how they affected our community. In 1918, the H1N1 virus, or the Spanish flu, influenza pandemic, first reached Dallas. Pictured here, you can see soldiers in Love Field, which was right next to Elm Thicket, North Park. Love Field was actually a Black community at the time. Some of this land had been recaptured, had become an army fort to set up for the pandemic. And so that Black land was taken to set up this army fort, which was in Love Field at the time. You can see some of the headlines from that time. It's similar to some of the headlines we see here. Keep away from crowds if you want to steer clear of influenza. It says influenza is a crowd disease, therefore keep out crowds as much as possible. It's really interesting that some of this language that was there 100 years ago, we had really not been taught about pandemics in school and the way that they spread. But we knew that pandemics would happen again, particularly epidemics, and that if we have a crowd disease, we need to practice social distancing. So it's really interesting how kind of our economy really took hold, particularly capitalism, and that it did not protect us. You can see right here, it says Spanish influenza increasing in the city. A total of 36 cases were reported by physicians. Up to about 800 people in Dallas died of influenza. It wasn't one of the largest outbreaks, but it was some of the same things happened. And so you can see things like reporting by race and ethnicity was very hard to contain. There was mixed messages being put out by our leaders. So some of those similar things happened. We also had the HIV epidemic in 1981 to present. You can see here in Dallas County, residents living with diagnosed HIV infections. Here in 1985, when folks were starting to learn more about the disease, and then the virus, 1993, the case definition expanded. You can see this is a chart of what happened in Dallas County. At the end of 2017, it was recorded that approximately 90,000 people were living with HIV in Texas, and 22,000 of them were in Dallas. And so HIV is still a virus. There's no cure for this virus, and that folks have been working really hard in the communities and in the county to provide protections from HIV. The number of Dallas County residents that have been newly diagnosed with HIV was around 800 in 2017. Data shows that the priority population of people living with HIV are African-American men, as 48% of new diagnoses in 2017 were Black, and around 80% of them were male. I think that's 8%. In 2014, the Ebola crisis, Dallas County, actually Dallas, the city of Dallas, became the first and only city that had Ebola. This gentleman by the name of Thomas had recently come from Liberia, where he'd been infected with Ebola, and he showed up at the doorstep of Texas Health Presbyterian, who had no protocols for Ebola because our county government at the time was not prepared for epidemics and pandemics. And he was denied. Also a precursor of which people of color have a lack of trust of medical professions because we had been denied health care or told that we need to go home, we're not sick enough. He came back a few days later, deathly ill, where he received some care. Once it was found that he had Ebola, there was martial law put around his neighborhood. His neighborhood is a neighborhood called Vickery Meadow. Vickery Meadow is known as a refugee community where communities of color specifically, but communities around the world, when Dallas takes in refugees, they go to communities like Vickery Meadow. Vickery Meadow is also former Freedmanstown, by the way, established by Black people after Reconstruction. And so this community was put under martial law. It was cut off from the rest of Dallas. There were armed guards around it. Folks were forced to stay in their homes and not leave the community. If they had left the community, they were issue warnings that they would be arrested or held or can be shot. And you can see how scary it was during that time. Once Thomas received care, there were two nurses, Nina and Amber, who were also affected, which also tells us about the history of women of color in being frontline workers in our hospitals and in our schools. They were both infected with Ebola and both received care outside of Dallas. Each one of these groups, particularly the family of Thomas, Nina and Amber, also sued Texas Presbyterian and all settled out of court because they were given no protections from Ebola. And now the county has now created protections. I think Clay Jenkins actually did a great job. He showed up with no PPE to the family of Thomas and offered them handshakes and made sure that at least the county government was protecting them. They also received stigma, and the community still receives stigmas around the city of Dallas because of this outbreak. So it's really something that we need to pay attention to. I was really struck by this kind of juxtaposition. During that time, the person of the year was known as the Ebola fighters. So you can see it's a Black person as a frontline worker fighting Ebola. Is a doctor at the time. And then fast forward to 2020, you see another cover celebrating heroes on the front line, and there's all Black women serving as frontline workers, cafeteria workers here in Dallas. Particularly under COVID-19, I was struck by this picture and really angered by it, particularly the passage. Yolanda Fisher and her team of workers who are passing out meals to families. She said that I was very nervous about contracting the virus. I have two grandchildren at home, ages 4 and 6. I can harm my family if I bring something home. It's always been on the back of my mind. She said, we have gloves, we wash our hands, we have sanitizers. She said, but the mask I purchased on my own. The school didn't have masks. They told us we can tie a bandana around our face, that would work. And, that really angered me as a person who is, realized that this is not the first time this has happened, but folks are still not receiving the respect, the pay, and the protection that they deserve. So, that really kind of concludes our talk. I want to engage folks in conversation. There's some things that we should be checking out. There's a racial wealth gap report that was published by JP Morgan Chase and Prosperity Now about Dallas. You can Google this and download it. I suggest that you do and check it out. There's also a Spark report. The Spark report is about homelessness in Dallas. In 2008, they found that 70% of The homeless people were Black people in Dallas. And then also this, which I'll really highlight really quickly. This is the Dallas Economic Opportunity Assessment Report. And it talks about a projection. And so this is really important. Historical population you can see on the left, but this projection shows that already right now, people of color are the majority here in Dallas County. So using the word minority is a misnomer. It says as the population has grown in the recent years, the racial and ethnic composition of the county has changed. By 2050, Black and Hispanic residents of Dallas County are projected to make up approximately 80% of Dallas County's population, and all people of color will make up approximately 88% of the projected 3.3 million Dallas County residents. But most of these people will be working in frontline jobs and jobs that are in service industry and jobs that are, cleaning and cooking, and we need to protect them. Some of the policy recommendations from that report from the Center for Public Policy Priorities was really clear. And these are things that we need to be serious about and engage in. One is engage in a comprehensive racial and ethnic equity outcome assessment of local policies and practices. Two, conduct racial and ethnic impact analysis of existing policies and identify fact-based policies that will close the achievement gap. Two, review city fees and expenses that may be stripping wealth from low-income poverty neighborhoods, and analyze city and county budgets. So the recommendations are clear. We need to start engaging in this work right now. We want to thank you for attending the History of Race in Dallas Continued. I want you to visit our website now for the report and COVID-19 resources. We have a COVID-19 tab with resources on it. Follow us on social media. If you have any questions or suggestions, want to support us, email us at info@dallastrhc.org. Use our hashtag COVIDEquityDFW and How We Heal. And we appreciate you. I hope you join us later. We'll be having a happy hour later on Google Hangouts. We'll be talking about partnership and anything else you want to talk about. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you.